First in our second series of asset management webinars. This is season 2, and we will be kicking off the series with a thought piece on the role asset management plays in improving organization resilience and really thinking about how we respond to the issues of 2020. As I said, my name is Chris Roberts. I lead the asset management and advisory the asset management and business advisory practice for WSP USA. And with me today is Wayne Hatcher. Wayne, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, good day, everybody. Wayne Hatcher. I'm Technical Director for Asset Management based in New Zealand. 30 years or more practicing in infrastructure asset management, and I'll be following on from Chris talking about thinking about asset management and response on a macro scale later in the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne. So on this webinar today, we plan exploring today's challenges, what we're seeing right now in 2020, and really thinking about it in the context of asset management. Thinking about how we respond now, so being immediate ready, and then thinking about the challenges as we move forwards. We have left time at the end for questions, and you will see on your screens a small box on the side there to add in questions. So if you've got any questions, please write them in the box, and then we will respond to those at the end of this session. What we thought we'd do, just as a refresh really, is start with a quick introduction to WSP and our global capabilities. WSP has established over the last 12 months a globally connected community of asset management professionals. We have high technical capabilities in all asset classes, and we've been very much working globally to really help to establish best practice in different market sectors and to transfer and spread that best practice between different geographic sectors. We work in the strategic advisory space and also in the tactical and operational levels within an organization. We help with strategy, with business transformation. We help identify organizational change, and we help identify how organizations can make better use of digital assets. And we're also working on a number of short, medium, and long-term asset management improvement initiatives, so actually helping organizations make changes to the way they're managing assets on a day-to-day basis. We've been key authors to a number of industry guidelines and international standards, including ISO 55001, the Asset Management Systems standard. I think it's also important to note that we also manage assets. So here in the United States, where I represent, we've been running the asset management office at California High Speed for a number of years, working to carry across those assets as they're constructed and move them into the operational world. And over in New Zealand, and if you have questions, Wayne can answer to that. And we are the head contractor for Westlink, which is the New Zealand road network manager. With other clients, we specialize in managing their information, and we help them to utilize that information to improve their management decisions or the management actions and their decision making. So let's move into the course of the webinar. And I thought what we'd do is just get back to some basics, start with an overview of what we mean by asset management. So when we talk about asset management, what we're talking about is those collective activities to manage the life cycle of the asset to achieve the organization goals and objectives. So we're thinking about those organization goals and objectives throughout the asset's life cycle, from the planning through maintenance, rehabilitation, and even at the disposal stage, taking the lessons learned and thinking about how we move things forwards. It is very much an integrated approach that requires consideration through all of those stages. So we do need to be thinking about what services we're trying to deliver. And it really is about having a plan in place to maintain and manage risk. It's about establishing that plan and putting in place controls to manage risks throughout the life cycle. Now, while most organizations have had plans in place to manage risks associated with things like asset deterioration or obsolescence, for example, and utilizing capital planning and rehabilitation to address those issues. They've not necessarily had the plans in place for all of the other operational scenarios, events, and incidents that we've seen through the course of the last decade, and certainly not had plans in place to manage those risks in a collective or collaborative way for what we've seen in 2020. When we talk about managing risks, we are very much talking about the policies, processes, and procedures, but it is very much about establishing that plan to how we manage risk. Now, when you think about 2020, I think I'd like to just pull up a quote from Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson so eloquently put, I think, what we're facing right now in 2020. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And that's very much what we're seeing in 2020. As we've seen over the course of the last 8-9 months, the world was really not ready for COVID-19. We've not been in a position to respond to that in a way that has helped us continue to provide services and deliver services and to utilize services. We've seen major economic challenges in industries like the transportation sector, massive downturn in the utilization of those assets. We've seen major social unrest spreading globally since since the beginning of May. And we've also seen some of the worst wildfires on record, both in Australia and currently happening right now in the United States, as well as the most active hurricane season on record also. Lots of things happening which are affecting how we manage assets and how the assets perform in their own right. There are other things happening in the background that are impacting how we're managing assets. So, for example, the FBI announced earlier this year that they are seeing a 400% increase in cybercrime and the impacts on some of the infrastructure that we rely on. So some serious challenges right now in how we are utilizing assets. As asset management practitioners, we have to understand all of these risks and develop capabilities to manage through it, both in the short term, in terms of recovery and response, but also thinking about the long term, building that resilience. And so to quote another boxer, it really is about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forwards. And I think what we found in 2020 is we've been hit and we now need to figure a way of moving forwards. And we need to think about the resilience of the organization and how we can continue to improve that resilience. As we think about the resilience of the organization, it's important to think about how we can make ourselves more immediate ready as well as future ready. So by that, I mean, when we think about the future and we're designing for the future needs of assets, we're really focusing on those organizational goals and outcomes and those levels of service that we want to provide in the future. To be immediate ready, we also need to think about some of those things because those goals and objectives for our assets change as we approach an event, both during the event and then following an event as we recover from that event. So the typical life cycle approach to managing assets and the typical timeline for how we set the agenda for the assets, set the goals, how we set the levels of service for the customers, how we set the levels of service for our assets, and then how we go about doing the work, very much focuses around that both immediate ready and future ready. As we think about establishing the controls for how we deliver work, we need to make sure that we have efficient practices in place for doing the right things. We need to make sure we've got effective practices in place for doing, we need to make sure we've got efficient practices in place for doing things right. So actually doing the work the way we planned to do it. We then need to make sure we've got effective practices in place for doing the right things. So that work needs to be delivering the outcomes that we had planned for in the first place. And then the value, the piece that we're very much focused on from an asset management context, is setting the right objectives. As we move into events like we've seen in 2020, as we go through those events and as we come out, setting those right objectives becomes a challenge. We have to map those objectives to the changing needs for the asset. And then from that, we have to push that back down into establishing what the right type of work is, and then how we perform that work. That is where we talk about managing assets and the asset management landscape. Our approach to helping organizations be immediate ready also helps them think about the longer term as well. We very much focus on that capability assessment piece, working with an organization to understand the processes and practices that they've got in place and how they can improve those processes and practices over time. Working with them to establish their controls and their management systems. And a key part of that is the continuity of operations plans. So thinking about what the essential functions are, thinking about who the essential people are, and how we build out that organizational capability to manage the short term as we come into an event and as we lead out from an event. We also need to think about monitoring, managing, and testing. So don't just put the plans in place, but actually work to make sure that they are implementable and make sure that we are, as an organization, able to respond to those events. Making sure that we've got alert systems in place so we know when we should start a response, and making sure that we've got the tools in place to follow that through. And of course, as any boxer will tell you, it's about training. We really need to make sure that we continue to test, train, and exercise. And we can do that through making sure that we're following the same controls and processes through every day, as well as when there's an emergency event on. Before I hand it over to Wayne, I did just want to focus a little bit on information, because information is something that will help us, not just in terms of being more efficient during an event, but also help us to define what we need to do post-event. This quote from New York MTA really talks to some of the challenges they faced during Superstorm Sandy and how they responded. That lack of information really hurting the response, the immediate response, as well as hurting how they responded in the medium to long term as they built their way out of the superstorm. So with that, I'm going to go on mute and I'm going to pass it over to Wayne, who will talk about how we move forwards.
Thank you, Chris. So picking on the theme to improve resilience and what Chris has talked earlier about managing risk, we really, in this post-crisis or immediate crisis world, need to take a much wider view than maybe we've done previously. Ultimately, as we've described, we're there, and our goals and objectives are to achieve stakeholder value and customer expectations. And previously, we've probably taken a relatively narrow view of that in terms of the closed system itself. Taking a wider view means we need to reflect more carefully on cost and particularly affordability, looking more carefully at service demand, particularly around quality and reliability, and then the all-encompassing risk. And
Wayne, I think you muted yourself. If you want to unmute your mic.
Thank you, Karina. I was unmuted and then I muted again. So thanks, Chris. To improve resilience and to manage risk, we need to take a much wider view than we had previously and consider much more the macro factors as we look to respond to crisis in the short term, but also plan for crises in the longer term. What I've presented here is the graphic represents really the three factors at play when we're looking to achieve outcomes for our stakeholders and our customers around cost and affordability, around the service standards that we work to, and then I've changed the risk there to look more carefully at demand, because that's the one area that we're really seeing potentially a big change of in the short term around what's happening around COVID, and we'll look a little bit more at that in the next slide. So in a, particularly looking at the pandemic aspect and trying to understand what the potential impacts are, we can see that, we know that demand is changing more quickly than we could have imagined. The picture there of the empty train, I presume one of the metro services in the US, we're also seeing the same impact on our public transport sector here in New Zealand and globally. Those significant demand changes probably were not quite so in our thinking than maybe they should have been in terms of thinking about our response. Despite demand, and if you're in the private sector world, then that means a revenue drop. Our assets continue to deteriorate and change over time, despite just through natural degradation. We're also challenged with an affordability angle where there's reduced employment potentially, and the ability to pay for services is also reduced. This all places significant risk on our typical goal of reducing cost of ownership, principally because we're able to invest optimally at the right time to get good outcomes for the asset. So that ability to invest at the right time is taken away because we don't often have the money to do that when we'd like to. Further compounding it, there's one particular scenario, particularly where we are, and certainly in our part of the world, where we do a lot of outsourcing of maintenance and operations, with because there's reduced money coming into the system, there's going to be reduced investment in maintenance and renewals potentially, leading to a change in service level. But in a private sector world, that leads to more competition for those limited resources. That competition leads to lower rates for maintenance and renewal, potentially leading to deflation. Now, on face value, that might seem good. We might be able to do more for less, but the reality is that less overall work leads to a poorer condition asset. Now, this then, that combines then to affecting the value of the asset. Now, a lot of our economies and private and public sector borrow for capital investment, and they borrow against the value of the assets that they have in their books. Now, if those asset values appear to reduce in value because the rates of renewal and the condition has reduced, then the ability to borrow against that is also reduced. Add to that the affordability angle of the ability to pay, and we're in potentially in some difficult position going forward. A perfect storm on the back of the GFC, where a lot of certainly public sector organisations are already highly leveraged in terms of borrowing. Thanks, Chris. Looking at the New Zealand context. So just looking at what we're facing here in New Zealand, some fundamental uncertainties. We've already talked about demand for service. I've talked about the potential for deflation, but if government stimulus comes in, particularly in the public sector, and it overstimulates, and that can happen in a constrained market, then there actually could be inflation. So we've got this dichotomy that we're potentially facing. And then there's the issue of discount rates. There of not just interest rates for borrowing, but the social cost of money as well. And that leads to outcomes like the inverted yield curve, where we end up paying or wanting more return in the short term than maybe we do in the long term. And so that leads to some quite difficult challenges around cash flow and what we expect to get from our investments short and medium term. Next slide. So we are having to deal with a great deal more uncertainty than we have in our immediate past. Now, that uncertainty can seem quite daunting at first, but with some pretty simple tools and techniques, we can start to break that uncertainty down into sort of classify it essentially into three types of uncertainty: environment uncertainty, objectives uncertainty, and related choice uncertainty. Now, environment uncertainty is where we don't know something about how things work. In other words, we've got changing dynamics in our economy, and so we are not all experts in the economy, and it's there's many uncertainties within that, but that's what we have to work with. And so we can take some views and we can gather evidence to inform ultimately our evidence-based decision. Objectives uncertainty is where we don't understand what it is we're trying to get to, where we're trying to get to. Are we trying to stimulate the economy? Are we trying to reduce our costs as an organisation? So there's competing objectives between wanting to spend more and having less to spend, and where we trade those off. And then there's the related choices uncertainty, where we don't understand the impact of one decision related to another. So if we spend less, what's that going to do to the local economy? In terms of the impact, is that going to have an impact that we then reduce our ability to charge for services, or do we spend more and stimulate the economy? Is that going to really encourage people to be a little less risk averse and therefore stimulate the economy? So we've got these really competing objectives. But what these sorts of approaches allow us to do is compartmentalize those risks and then start to break them down one at a time and investigate them further. Next slide, Chris, please. So one example is from the European Union, or from the UK particularly. We're probably beyond our normal, reaching beyond our normal sources of information to look further afield. And here's an example from, in terms of the flood response from the United Kingdom, looking at the way that they deal with uncertainty and how they then bring together their information into essentially a decision-making process. This is just one example that can be used to inform a decision-making process. In asset management, we're dealing with this and many other types of impacts, and we have to reach for these sources and many others to form the picture and fill in the gaps around those uncertainties to help us make well-informed decisions going forward. Thanks, Chris, back to you.
Thanks, Wayne. So a quick run through there around how we can be immediate ready, and then also thinking about how we move forwards and take charge of the challenges that we've been faced in 2020. I did think Wayne and I spoke a little beforehand about how best to bring this presentation to a close, and we very much felt that it was appropriate to talk about the recovery position. So tackling some of those issues that Wayne's talked about, and thinking more immediate term about how we can be better prepared for things like economic stimulus, etc. So one of the important lessons that we got from the 2008 global financial crisis is that role infrastructure investment can play in boosting economic development. We all know that. We all remember the shovel-ready projects. But a key lesson there was while shovel-ready projects are great projects for immediately impacting national economies and making full use of that economic stimulus, they are fairly short-lived. Most organizations really have far shorter plans, far shorter planning horizons, and so what we found as a key lesson from 2008 was that need for planning ready projects, those projects which are not ready to put boots on the ground and start construction, etc., but are there we've identified a need, we've started going through that planning stage, we're maybe even moving into a design stage, has a deferred impact on the economy, but it does allow for a sustained economic recovery over a longer period of time. With the COVID situation and everything else that we've seen in 2020, having some very deep financial cuts globally, the need really will be not just about having shovel-ready projects, but also thinking about that sustained recovery over the short and medium term. The other thing which we've both talked about there is really thinking about the future. So investing in our organizational capabilities. When we talk about future ready, we often focus on thinking about the design for the future and making sure those assets are designed for the future. But we also should be thinking about designing the organization capabilities as well. So a lot of the work that we do around gap assessments, around understanding capabilities within organizations, around improving information so that we can improve our organizational management actions and decision making, really is about making sure that we're future ready. When we have better information and we have more robust processes in place and we've got those control measures in place, we are in a much better position to respond to future events and to help the recovery from future events also. That is the end of our short first presentation as part of this webinar series. We've got a couple of questions that have come in already. Wayne, should we start with the questions that were posted just prior to the start of this webinar?
I suggest we do, yes.
Wayne, do you want to pick up the question from Canada, which was, can transportation and land use policy be evaluated for resilience so resilience can be prioritized in regional planning?
Yeah, so yes, it can. So I'm actually working on a project here in New Zealand where we are looking to align our transport sector entirely to our well-beings around economic prosperity, environmental sustainability, resilience and security, environmental sustainability, and inclusive access. So those are our 5 outcomes that we're looking to invest in for our entire transport sector. So in terms of risk and resilience, we are very much looking to get outcomes in that area, and one way we're looking to do that is through the entire transport sector, starting with our planners and our spatial plans through to our district plans at a municipality level. Really influencing the way of the transport going forward, which includes resilience. And we've got some measures and metrics around that. New Zealand is a very active country geologically, and we are often challenged with road closures and transport disruptions due to that. So it is part of our thinking nationally to respond to it. So short answer is yes, you can.
Great, thanks, Wayne. I'll take the next question, which was from somebody in the United Kingdom. They asked the question, natural disasters had been planned for, however, had any public organizations, councils, water utilities, etc., considered pandemics? I'll talk a little bit about that from the US perspective, and then Wayne, if you've got anything you want to add, please feel free. I think what we've seen in the US is a surprisingly slow start to the pandemic response, and then a lot of activity to figure out how we respond and then how we recover services, etc. A lot of that, of course, is driven just by the unknowns associated with COVID-19. But in addition to that, very few organizations had pandemic continuity of operation plans in place, very few. One organization that I did come across that did have a pandemic plan in place, not for pandemic influenzas, it was for a different disease altogether, spoke to me about some of the challenges which they'd had at that time when that disease was on the horizon, how they had built out this continuity of operations plan, but had done very little to implement or trial and test and exercise that plan. And it was only actually in those early days of COVID-19, when everybody was sort of running around a little bit trying to figure out what to do next, did that plan actually come to light. But it certainly didn't impact their response to this. What we have seen, I think, through the course of the last 8 months is an incredible effort to better understand it, to put in place those continuity of operations plans, to establish the concept of essential workers and essential functions, and really build out that capability. I think personally there's an awful lot more that can be done and should be done, not least for the fact that we should be thinking about alert levels, etc., for pandemics. And of course, pandemics don't happen in isolation. What we've seen in the United States, what we're seeing right now is, as I mentioned earlier, that very active hurricane season in the middle of a pandemic. So how do you respond to natural disasters when you have this pandemic situation that you need to contend with at the same time? Those two things coming together introduce an awful lot more risk and an awful lot more need to have a clear plan in place for how we respond. Wayne, do you want to add anything to that?
It's a fairly similar picture probably in New Zealand, except maybe our health ministry had actually practiced for a pandemic last year. And went through the processes, and so we're probably more prepared because of that study they did, that trial they did last year. Even though they recognised that they didn't actually implement a lot of the practices that they had discussed from that trial, but they'd at least had the mindset of practicing for a pandemic to go forward on, and that's where our alert level system came from. So we're one of the few countries that started this alert level system. And that came out of that. So practice, even though it mightn't match the scenario, has proven to be very, very useful in terms of a response from the New Zealand perspective.
Great, thank you. We have another question here from Australia, which is asked, has risk management become more conservative as a result? I'll maybe just start that way and give you a chance to think about it, and then you can jump in. And I'm going to start it a little bit more bluntly by saying risk management is certainly in some of the industry sectors that we work with, something that's still very much in I wouldn't say a level of infancy, but I would say in an early stage of development in terms of how you use risk management as a set of principles to guide the planning and the investment in assets and asset management. So it is something that is being contended with right now. It's being considered, and we're starting to build that out. Risk management is definitely being used in the design of assets and thought about in the project and program. Whether it's now more conservative, I don't know whether I would say that. I think they're probably right now still utilizing a lot of the same concepts and managing the same risks. Definitely from a planning point of view, from an asset management point of view, I don't think we've started to really think about that with many of the social infrastructure agencies which we work with in the United States. Wayne, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think I'm just wondering about the wording of the question. Risk management has become more conservative. So risk management has probably become more inclusive or more broad reaching in the things it's considering. And that's what I've presented really, that we need to, if we aren't already, take a much broader view of risk. And we tend to be, I suppose, if you want to look at engineers particularly tend to be quite conservative in the way that they understand risk and seem to think we can manage our way out of anything. And so probably from that perspective, we may be less conservative, realizing we can't. But I wonder whether the question is more around risk appetite, the ability of an organization to take on more risk relative to what they did previously. And I think that will very much depend on the type of organization we're working with, public sector versus private sector. Whether there's an increased risk appetite going forward, and uncertainty just plays against that. Anything where uncertainty isn't in the game will generally lead to a more conservative approach. Uncertainty and risk don't play well together.
I think from my perspective, there's a better understanding now that risk management as an approach to supporting planning and management of assets is something that definitely needs to be considered. And we do need to be thinking about a broader spectrum of risks, not just whether the asset becomes obsolete or whether the asset is deteriorating more rapidly, but also some of those risks that are going to impact how we manage that asset, how we physically do the work, and what if we get a second wave of the pandemic? How are we going to undertake that work in a safe way? Is something which I think is definitely challenging most of the organizations we're working with now.
Totally agree, Chris. Totally agree.
Got another question here that came in early on. Does WSP have experience in asset management related to ITS, to Intelligent Transportation Systems? I'll pass that over to you, Wayne, if you want to make a start.
Yes, we do, particularly from our UK operation, and a little bit from Australia and New Zealand as well. So short answer, yes.
Good. Sorry to dump that one on you there. I'll maybe just add to that one of the things which we've started to look at with Intelligent Transportation Systems, those sorts of systems are very information hungry. we need to know information about the asset. We need to know information about how that asset is operating, etc. And so having information not just about the intelligent parts, but also the not so intelligent parts like the pavements and the concrete is absolutely critical to making that a success. So as we go through right now thinking about future ready and helping our organizations become ready to take on some of these assets, we are very much focused around helping them to understand how they capture information, how they make sure that information adds value to the organization, and how they're going to utilize that information for management actions and decision making. So whether it's an ITS or whether it's another form of intelligent asset, there's a lot of those kicking around right now in different industry sectors. We definitely have the experience in helping to bring them on board. And I think that's it for our questions. We'll maybe hold the line open for a couple of minutes longer to see if anybody else has any questions. No. Okay. Well, with that, I'll let my colleagues down under have an early start to their day, and myself and colleagues in Europe have an earlier finish to their day. I wish you all a good day. I thank you for joining our first webinar in this series. We have a number of other sessions lined up through to the end of the year, focused on some of the challenges that we're seeing in 2020 and how we respond to that, and thinking a little bit more about how the role of asset management, not just in terms of the managing and maintaining assets as we've traditionally thought about it, but also thinking about how we finance and invest in assets and how we plan and manage risk as well. So we'll continue this dialogue through to the end of the year. Thank you for your time today, and we will finish this webinar momentarily.